Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're listening on. We're so glad you tuned in. We got a treat for you today. And we have with us here Edward Ionel, and he is the head of developer relations at Mirantis. And he works specifically with one of Mirantis products, which is Lens. And that's going to be the focus of our talk today. And Edward is going to be providing a lot of information on that and giving us some really good ideas. So we're going to talk about Lens. Edward, it's great to have you here with us. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, Dwayne. Thank you for having me. Couldn't be more excited to be here to discuss all things Lens with you. I'm looking forward to the session. Thank you.
So yeah, starting with a bit of the backstory. So Lens was acquired by Mirantis about a couple of years ago, I think 1.5 years or 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And, so if you could take us a bit about, just the idea of Lens, why, was there a need for something like Lens and sort of the backstory of
Absolutely.
Lens? That would be a great starting point.
Absolutely. So Lens was acquired from a company called Container. We actually acquired the entire team at Container. They were specifically focused on building Launchpad for our for our Mirantis Kubernetes engine that allows you to deploy this very easily. And when our CEO was looking at Container, he also came across Lens, the Kubernetes IDE. And Lens is quite interesting. And the reason why it was actually built is because the team behind Container had to get full situational awareness of everything that's happening within the Kubernetes cluster. So Adrian, our CEO, saw this and was actually quite interested in Lens itself. And we had the opportunity to bring Lens to Mirantis as well, and not just that amazing team behind Container. And it was very much of a bonus because the team behind Container, one of the most amazing teams I've ever had the opportunity to work with. So having them come to Mirantis was absolutely phenomenal and is a huge part of some of our success. And then also the bonus of getting Lens with that as well. So yes, we acquired Lens back in, I would say, January or February of 2020, maybe a little bit before that. And that's when we brought that entire team into Mirantis and we became one.
Awesome. That's a great story. And, I followed Mirantis since back in the days when it was very OpenStack centric. And, I just want to say really kudos to you guys as a company, because, the way you guys have been able to make a pivot and, be able to acquire companies like Docker Enterprise and
Yes.
Container. And, to today to where, it's a completely different organization and really at the cutting edge of Kubernetes. I need to say, congratulations and kudos to you and the team for just making such a great transition.
Oh, thank you so much. That warms all of our hearts. And yes, absolutely. Our primary focus is always ensuring that the customer is getting everything they can out of containerizing their applications and shipping code faster at scale. So when we saw Kubernetes coming, we knew this was going to be a technology that is industry standard in terms of containerizing applications at scale and so forth. So that's when we decided to make a pivot. That being said, we still very much do offer Mirantis OpenStack, and we have a product offering that is OpenStack on top of Kubernetes, which is extremely interesting. So OpenStack is still very much part of our business. We have many organizations that are focused on OpenStack, but now Kubernetes has scaled, and that's where our primary focus is.
Really interesting. And we want to do definitely a separate whole other talk on, the other offerings of Mirantis. But for today, we're going to be focusing on what you work on at Mirantis, which is Lens. And quite excited to talk about that because, it is
Absolutely.
unique. It is quite a unique product because, there's not too many like it around. So,
Right.
I just wanted to start off with you talking about, an ID and, what are the signs that, someone working with Kubernetes would realize, okay, these are signs that I need an ID, I need something like Lens. What are some of the problems or the pain points that you would say people would
Sure.
notice?
Absolutely. So there's many. It's all specific to different personas, but maybe we start earlier in the cycle. So one, Lens is built for somebody that's also just getting started with Kubernetes that may not understand all of the objects and resources within a Kubernetes cluster and what they're supposed to do. So that's Lens is very much for people new to Kubernetes. But then there's
All
several
right.
personas we see with Lens as well. One of them being people that are operating a cluster, from a site reliability engineer or a cloud architect or something along these lines. These people want to very much understand the overall health of their cluster. And then we have our developers that come in as well, a different persona, that want to understand how their applications or microservices were deployed on top of that cluster. And Lens is going to give each persona full situational awareness of everything that's happening within a cluster. So from a novice to an expert. And then from one persona, which is a site reliability engineer or cloud architect or Kubernetes operator, then to the developer that actually needs to push that code on top of a Kubernetes service. We also see a lot of DevOps managers leveraging Lens as well, where they're doing a little bit of both, trying to understand the deployments, how they're performing, downloading the logs, pushing those to developers, and so forth.
Wow, I think that's a great summary of the problem Lens solves. And I think what's fascinating is that a lot of the solutions you see in the space today are very infrastructure centric and very ops centric. But I think Lens really unifies the dev side and the ops side, and you really brought that out in your answer just now. So I wanted to dig a little bit more into that. If you could share a bit on what you touched on already about how the experience differs for someone from the development team versus someone from the SRE and ops team.
Sure.
What's it like using Lens day to day for these two teams? How does it differ? How's it the same?
Absolutely. So we'll start off with the SRE or the operator side. Typically speaking, an SRE wants to understand the overall health of each and every single cluster that they're managing. So through Lens, you do have that multi-cluster management where you can connect any Kubernetes cluster, regardless of the distro, as long as it's a certified Kubernetes cluster. You can connect that to Lens and then have the ability to switch from cluster to cluster to cluster while always maintaining the correct endpoint of that Kubernetes cluster. So me being an operator, I can be working with a Mirantis Kubernetes Engine cluster and switch in a matter of seconds to a K0S cluster that's also developed by Mirantis and Team Lens in a matter of seconds. So operators within their workflow or SREs as well are generally going to be leveraging Lens at the beginning of their workflow. They're going to want to ensure that all clusters are operating successfully and healthily, and switch from cluster to cluster while always maintaining that correct context. So for SREs and operators, it's at that beginning of their workday, their workflow, just understanding that the cluster is performing correctly. Then we take a look at the DevOps and the developers, and it's actually happening at the end of their workflow. So generally speaking, a developer is going to write code in some form of IDE. They're going to actually have to push that to Git. And then from there, they're going to have to leverage some form of CICD pipeline to ensure that their microservice or application was pushed to their Kubernetes service successfully. This is where Lens comes in. Lens is coming in at the end of the workflow for a developer to really allow them to troubleshoot, one, why their application wasn't deployed successfully, or two, be able to review that it was deployed successfully. From there, depending on the use case, say for example that it wasn't deployed successfully, they will be able to leverage Lens to access pod logs and deployment logs to really tell them why it wasn't able to be deployed directly to their Kubernetes service. So operator, they're leveraging Lens at the beginning of their workflow, understanding the full situational awareness of the cluster and the overall health for multiple clusters. Because generally speaking, what we see is they're working with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different clusters, all the way from proof of concept to development to production and so forth. Then from the developer standpoint, of course, they're going to be pushing code and applications to all of these different stages as well, from proof of concept to development to production. But Lens comes in at the end of the workflow to really, really understand how that deployment, that microservice is performing on top of the Kubernetes cluster, and then leveraging Lens to very easily pull the logs without actually having to learn any kubectl. And this is one of the biggest values that we see with Lens for everyone. It's the ability to perform many different actions within their Kubernetes cluster without the need of writing kubectl, which is complicated. Many developers don't want to have to go learn kubectl and YAML to perform their day-to-day responsibilities. They want to be able to ship applications very quickly and ensure that that application is performing correctly.
Okay, wow, that's a lot. You touched on a couple of things I'd like to dig into a little more. One was you spoke about CICD and how Lens connects with that. And two, you also talked about logs and how Lens delivers that intelligence. So, I'd like to talk a bit about these two things, starting with just CICD and even Git, repositories and stuff. So, that's, where developers spend their time. Those are the kind of the tools that developers use most. How does Lens integrate with this, and what's the developer experience like working with Lens and their CI/CD and Git repositories?
Sure. Sure. So as of right now, there is no direct connection between CI/CD pipelines and Lens's development workflow. It's
Hmm.
happening after the CI/CD pipeline stage of that development workflow. So the
Okay.
developer will write the code, they'll push it to the CI/CD pipeline, and then hopefully it deploys to the Kubernetes service. And that's actually when they leverage Lens. After that process, they're going to use Lens to troubleshoot and see what exactly is happening to that deployment on top of that Kubernetes service. So it's
Got it.
not one-to-one with the CI/CD pipeline.
All right. All right. Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. And it seems like Lens delivers a lot of visibility and just awareness of what's happening. Could you
Mm.
share a bit more about that? The logs. Just dig a little bit more into what kind of logs. Where does Lens get these logs from? Does Lens connect to the Kubernetes cluster directly, or does it connect with a logging service? Could you just share a bit more context, a
Absolutely,
bit more details there?
absolutely. So Lens is connecting directly to the Kubernetes API of your kubeconfig file. So it
Hmm.
is connecting directly to that. But when we think about all the visualizations that you can achieve through Lens, you actually get to be able to understand the health of every single object within your cluster, all the way from pods, nodes, deployments, daemon sets, all of the above. You're able to very easily visualize how it's performing very
Hmm.
easily. We also provide our users, dependent on their role-based access control, admin functions that they can perform without writing any kubectl. Some of those
Hmm.
admin functions are shelling into a node,
Hmm.
or pulling your logs, or changing some form of YAML to your Kubernetes configuration. So these are all admin functions that somebody can perform, all based off of their role-based access control from the kubeconfig file that's connected to Lens.
Hmm. Interesting, really interesting. And all of this observability and monitoring data, it actually provides context, and that's something that Lens really talks a lot about, context. Could
Yes.
you give us some examples of the kind of context that Lens provides?
Absolutely, absolutely. So say I'm an operator or an SRE and I'm
Hmm.
coming to my day taking a look at all of these different clusters. When you're switching from cluster to cluster, you're going to want to be able to visualize your CPU, your memory, your disk on top of your cluster. But there's also something very important that somebody would want to look at, which is
Hmm.
a drop in the file system. So Lens is going to tell you and show you that there was a drop in the file system, and then give you real-time alerts and events that's going to tell you specifically which object is involved and why this is happening. From there, you can go and again review those logs or perform admin functions on top of this observability that you're receiving, through the
Hmm.
real-time events, through the drop in the file system, but really leveraging Prometheus to tell our users in a graphical user interface what is happening to their cluster.
All right, so I wanted to talk a bit more about all of this monitoring data. So how's Lens built? Is it built to visualize all of this data and get like a visual overview of your Kubernetes cluster, or is it built to
Hmm.
type in commands and get just exactly the specific kind of data you need, or can you do both?
That's an excellent question. So it's the latter. You can do
Hmm.
both. It's really dependent on the workflow that you like to work within. So
Hmm.
we see many of our users actually leveraging the graphical user interface, leveraging the visualizations, performing commands through the admin functions without writing any kubectl. We know lots of people like to do this because you're working at a much faster rate. You're much more productive compared to writing one command line to view your pod, and then you have to write another command line to view your logs within a pod and so forth. Through the GUI, you can actually do all of these things within seconds. And that's where Lens is saving people a lot of time. Now, there's people like me, and there's many of our colleagues that like to work within a CLI. If you like to work within a CLI, Lens is
Hmm.
always connecting to the correct kubectl version of your cluster and the correct context of your cluster as well. So it's connecting to the correct API. So if I switch from my Mirantis Kubernetes Engine cluster to, let's say, a Minikube cluster, I'm ensured that my terminal is always working in the correct context and that the kubectl version is downloaded and updated as well. So it's entirely up to the user. That being said, we do believe that majority of our users are leveraging the graphical user interface compared to the CLI.
Oh, I really like that. I mean, so it basically caters to a wide range of users, and irrespective of what you like, it's got both. That's really great. I
Absolutely.
want to touch a bit on kind of the new stuff that's happening with Lens. I saw that there's a bunch of new updates that have recently come to Lens. So I want to have you talk a bit about Spaces. So what's Spaces in Lens?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and it's something very exciting and honestly a brand new technology to this industry. So
Hmm.
I would love to spend some time here.
Hmm.
Lens spaces should be thought of as a collaborative environment that allows team members to collaborate when working with Kubernetes. Specifically, what I mean by that is if you and I are colleagues, say you're a developer and I am a cluster admin, and I need
Hmm.
you to be able to view specific microservices within a namespace in my cluster. Through Lens Spaces, I can actually invite you to a space where we add a Kubernetes cluster to that space. And based off of your role-based access control, you can perform various different functions. So the neat thing
Hmm.
behind this is I can have a Kubernetes cluster running on my operating system on-prem on my local machine. I can share that cluster with you while you're in India, and you'll be able to have access to that cluster without me ever exposing the kubeconfig file to you. So this is one of the best security practices because generally speaking, if somebody has access to your kubeconfig file with the full permissions, they can do whatever they want. So if they have access to your control plane node, they can kill your entire cluster very easily. But Lens Spaces really allows organizations to mitigate that risk where I have a team of developers that need to access a default namespace within my cluster to review their microservices. I can very easily invite 50 developers to this space that I mentioned, and they'll have access only to that namespace. So the neat thing behind Lens Spaces is you can give somebody access to a Kubernetes cluster without ever exposing the kubeconfig file, and then you can perform granular permissions to ensure that they're only reviewing specific items within your cluster, generally speaking, namespaces.
That's awesome. So granular permissions, you mean even within the dev team, you can go to individual developers and say these developers just need access to these particular resources. You can be that specific.
Yes, yes, and we're definitely leveraging your role-based access control here. So we're
Hmm.
tying the role-based access control against Lens Spaces. But that being said, the meat behind this, besides of why it's very valuable, is the security concern. I can give a team of developers access to a Kubernetes cluster in seconds compared to shipping a kubeconfig file to them, right? And then them having to add it to Lens and ensure the role-based access control is correct and so forth. So Lens Spaces allows us to give and revoke access to a Kubernetes cluster in a matter of seconds without ever exposing the kubeconfig file to our users or to anybody.
That's awesome. And I think that speaks to just enabling developer productivity. And which also brings me to my next feature that recently has well been released in Lens, which is devcluster. Could you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just recently, we released this feature called Hosted Dev Cluster by Team Lens. And the reason why we released this feature, before I talk about it specifically what it does, but the
Hmm.
reason we released this feature is we feel that many developers or organizations are either leveraging a Kubernetes cluster on their local machine, which is slowing down their actual resources of the laptop, right? Their CPU can't really keep up with that. Then we
Hmm.
also see that developers or organizations are spending a lot of money on these development clusters if they're hosted in the cloud. So the neat thing
Hmm.
behind Dev Cluster is Team Lens is hosting a development cluster for all of our users. Anybody can get started with Kubernetes by a click of a button, but the neat thing behind it is we have an auto wake and auto sleep functionality that ensures that organizations aren't leveraging unused resources. So we're ensuring that the resources that are being spent are actually being used correctly, right? As well as taking the Kubernetes cluster away from developers' machines and putting it into the cloud or being hosted by us. Because one of the biggest things that we see for developers is they have so many programs running on their local machine that adding like a Minikube cluster to their machine just isn't feasible. So then they move to the public cloud to work and to develop on top of, which is excellent. But then we take a look at that, and leadership is spending a lot of money on these development clusters, and majority of the resources aren't being used. And this is why we introduced devcluster with the ability to have the auto wake up and auto shutdown functionality that ensures that you're only leveraging resources that you should be using.
I love this. I think it's really smart, that the Lens developers, the way that they plan these things, that, there's multiple benefits even in just a single feature. I love how, devcluster, it reduces the resource consumption. At the same time, it saves cost. I like,
Yes,
just like we spoke earlier, you can, if you want to visualize your monitoring data, you can do that. Or if you want to do it the command line way, you can do that.
you
I
can do
like the
that too.
flexibility. I like that, all of these features are built with so many different types of users in mind.
Yes,
That's awesome.
absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things we're so focused on is ensuring that our users are really gaining a ton of value from all of our products across Mirantis. And we're continuously interviewing our customers, speaking with our users, and trying to get a better understanding of what they would like to see to improve their productivity, their return on investment for container initiatives, and so forth. So we're always thinking about the end user when building products.
That's awesome. Winding down here with the interview, finally, I just wanted to touch on just Lens and its integration with, these huge open source tools in Kubernetes. There's Prometheus for time series data, and there's Helm, the package manager.
Yeah.
Lens, really puts a lot of spotlight on these tools. Could you talk a bit about that, the importance of these tools and the Lens experience, and just Lens and open source?
Absolutely, absolutely. So as we know, the cloud native space is quite dense. There's so many different technologies that you can use for all kinds of use cases, whether alerting, monitoring, Helm chart deployments, and so forth. So what we took a look at was how can we allow our users to very easily visualize their Kubernetes cluster without necessarily having to deploy Grafana or Prometheus on top of the Kubernetes cluster. So with Lens, we actually can deploy Prometheus directly to your cluster within seconds if you agree to it, or you can bring in your own monitoring system, your visualization system, to Lens, and we'll be able to visualize that as well. So we're leveraging Prometheus for definitely for users that don't want to have to install it and deploy it directly to their cluster on their own. And people have the ability to bring in their own visualization to Lens if they choose to do so. Regarding Helm charts, we believe Helm charts are actually a fantastic way for new Kubernetes users to get a better understanding of how an application is deployed to your Kubernetes service. So within Lens, we do have the ability where you can deploy Helm charts directly to your Kubernetes cluster through a section within Lens. So we wanted to package that as well for users because you get to do it by a click of a button compared to writing a bunch of command line. So it just makes it a lot easier for our users, from visualization to the Helm charts. Again, we're always focused on increasing productivity and really eliminating the complexity of Kubernetes and other cloud native technologies.
All right. Yeah, that's awesome. So, as a last comment, I'd like to just hear from you about, what would you say is the one thing that you'd like the listeners from, to take away with them? If you think they're considering Lens, they're thinking about an IDE, they're thinking about all these ideas that you spoke about just now. There's a lot.
Sure.
But if you were to just summarize, what's one thing you'd say is a good takeaway from this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that Lens is open source and free, and anybody can get started through our website. And it really does allow you to, whether you're a novice in Kubernetes or an expert, it's going to really provide a lot of value for wherever you are in your cloud native journey. Again, from a developer to an operator, an SRE, a novice, and an expert. So what I want you to take away from this is give Lens a chance. It's free and you can get started with it today, and you really will get a better understanding of how Kubernetes works, as well as increasing your productivity if you work with Kubernetes on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. That's great. So before we're done, we have a last little segment here where we ask a bunch of fun questions to sort of get to know you a little bit more. So
Sure.
yeah, it's going to be about five or so questions. So let's go. So which is one tech leader or innovator or developer
Mhm,
or expert that you admire the most, and why?
mhm. Does it have to be specific to tech, or
Uh,
can I
yeah, you could do,
anything influential
yeah,
person?
yeah, sure.
Um, I would say Gandhi. I would say
Okay.
Gandhi for what he was able to do in
Hmm.
terms of freedom of speech and bringing people together for a common cause. I think that really set forward for all different people across the world where it's important to love one each other, work with each other and so forth. So this is somebody that's extremely inspirational to myself, and I follow a lot of the practices that he does as well, or that he did. So this is somebody that I think has made the world a much better place. And that's more of somebody that I look up to. I'm not so interested in other like tech leaders and things like this. I'm more focused on somebody that really tries to give back to the larger group of people and really try to come together for a common cause. So that's actually somebody that I find extremely inspirational.
Wow, respect. I love that. It's amazing that someone all the way in the US follows someone who lived in India so many years ago. I really love that.
Absolutely. It's amazing what this individual has done, and it's just absolutely incredible.
Hmm. Yeah, awesome. One word you'd use to describe yourself.
One word to, I'm gonna use two.
Okay.
Um, and
With a
it's
hyphen
just,
between it.
yeah, just begin.
All right. Your startup guy. That's
Just
awesome.
start. Just start. Let's go. Let's move. Just begin. We'll solve the problems later. Let's just start.
All right, cool. Um, which part of the day are you most productive in?
Ah, that's an excellent question. I am a morning person. I'm a morning
Oh,
person.
all right.
Typically speaking, I like to get majority of my heads down work done between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. and then I go into a bunch of meetings. So I like to get as much work done as possible in the morning, and then in the late afternoon, I like to transition into other activities that I enjoy.
All right, cool. Are you into working out? If yes, which is your favorite workout exercise sort of routine?
Yeah, absolutely. I am very much interested in working out. I work out almost on a daily basis. I love weightlifting, but I have picked up a new hobby now, which is boxing. So I've been boxing for the
Well,
last couple of years, and I enjoy that quite a lot.
awesome. All right. Your favorite tech blog or journal
Sure.
or writer? Yeah.
Sure. So in terms of tech, I don't have a favorite tech blog, but what I love to
Mhm.
do is leverage medium.com and Hacker Noon. These are developer websites that are meant for blogging. That's honestly where
Mhm.
I gain the most value when I'm trying to really understand a technology or something along these lines. So I don't have one particular person. I just have this wonderful community within the cloud native community that I try to leverage and learn from on a day-to-day basis. So I recommend leveraging Medium, Hacker Noon, and so forth. These are awesome blogging sites where you can choose the topics that you're interested in, and then you'll get curated content specific to the topic that you're interested in.
Awesome. So yeah, the last, not really a question, but more info. Where do we find you online? How do we connect with you?
Oh, that's awesome. So I'm on Twitter. It's my last name, Edward. So Ionel Edward at Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Those are the only two places that I am. But that being said, you can come join our Slack community channel, which is kslens.dev at Slack. Join that channel and come interact with me. We're always trying to give back to the community, whether it's hoodies, whether it's KubeCon passes. So we're always trying to give back to our end users and the cloud native community. So find me on Slack, reach out to me on Twitter. I'll be there, and I'm more than happy to engage with everyone and everybody.
That's awesome. So closing out, I want to thank you all for watching to the end, and want to remind you to head over to amazic.com, amazic.com. That's where you'll find a lot more interviews like this from various tech influencers, leaders. And you can find not just interviews, you can even find event coverage, articles, job listings. There's a bunch of stuff happening. So go check it out and stay tuned, subscribe, And stay tuned for much more talks like this. So with that, we'll close it out here with a word of thanks to Edward. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us. Really appreciate all that you shared, and really looking forward to connecting with you more.
Absolutely. Couldn't be happier to be here today. Thank you, everybody that's watching, that stuck around. I hope you are well, and thank you again for having me.